Hello and welcome. Of course, Syria is a top priority in the Middle East nowadays, and it's all on your top priority on your agenda. First of all, when we talk or when the Americans talk about the political solution and not a military solution,
Right.
who are you talking about? The Syrians or the Russians or the Iranians? Who's going to sit and talk with who to finalize this conflict in Syria?
Well, there's quite a well-defined roadmap that we can follow in UN Security Council Resolution 2254, which lays out a political process that can result in a differently constituted government. All of the milestones are built in, they're well defined. It has international buy-in already from the Security Council and from a broad swath of the international community. So UNSCR 2254 is our Bible, it's our roadmap for how to get to a political settlement, a political solution in Syria. That resolution also has other aspects than just the political process. What I mean by the political process is built into that resolution is the Geneva peace process, for which there have been several rounds of negotiations in the past. But it also has built into it, very interestingly, a ceasefire process, which can actually tamp down the violence and reduce the pressure in that conflict to give more space for the political process to work.
Okay, so first of all, if Syrians are going to talk to each other and solve the solution, do you think this is going to be sponsored by the international community or it can be done alone?
I think the way it stands right now in this conflict, the Syrians need the help of the international community in a variety of ways. I would say, first and foremost, this peace process, in order for it to make progress now, there has to be clear conditions set out by the international community on what is required of the Syrian government in order for the international community to re-engage with the Syrian government and to normalize relations with the Syrian government. To be quite frank with you, there has to be pressure placed upon the Syrian government to stop seeking a military solution to the conflict, to stop seeking to resolve the conflict by the gun, and instead to tamp down the conflict, respect ceasefires, and come to the table and work things out through dialogue.
Mr. Rayburn, how are the Syrians going to deal with the same faces that they put so many massacres to them, next to them? I mean, this same government and this same president has caused 500,000 deaths over the past 7, 8 years,
Right.
and
Right.
millions of people are displaced. So are we dealing with the same government, same president, or there's a need for a total new change?
I think you're seeing a broad and growing consensus in the international community that the relationship of the government of Syria to its people has got to change. It's got to cease the hostility. There has to be a different model, a different method of governance in Syria. And in order for there to be political reconciliation, which is so essential for a settlement to the conflict, there's got to be accountability for the atrocities that have gone before, the vast majority of which have been carried out by the government against its own people.
This conflict is a proxy war between Russia and the US and the Iranians and the GCC countries. So there's another level to this. How can the international community stop Iran, at least ask them to withdraw their militias and their armed groups fighting on the ground in Syria?
I know of no one in the international community, no legitimate actor in the international community that supports the very destabilizing and provocative behavior and policies that the Iranian regime is carrying out in Syria. The Iranian regime is absolutely isolated on this question. The idea that the Iranian regime would use Syria in order to establish power projection platforms that it can use to threaten Syria's neighbors in an unprecedented way, in an unprecedentedly destabilizing way. This is something the entire international community rejects. It's something that the US, the European Union countries, the Arab world are all in agreement agreement about using the tools at our disposal, such as economic pressure tools, such as political pressure tools and political isolation, to try to push back on.
It seems to be now that this Syria issue or conflict has been tied up to the nuclear issue with Iran. So tightening the grip on Iran's nuclear ambitions has somehow resulted in escalation in Syria. Iran won't accept to negotiate anymore. Do you think the two files are interconnected, or do you think you can still solve the Syria issue irrelevant of the nuclear ambitions?
Well, I think what you're really saying is that whether it's the tensions surrounding the nuclear file, or it's the Iranian destabilizing behavior in Syria and in the region more broadly, including Yemen, Iraq, elsewhere, that what we're talking about is an aggressive, adventurous foreign policy from the Iranian regime. So it's a broader phenomenon, and that's what's got to stop if there's going to be peace in the region and if the Iranian regime expects to enjoy normal relations with the rest of the world.
What about the Russians? Are you talking to them? And do you think if the US sits with Russia to solve the issue in Syria, can this be done? Can you influence Iran, or maybe the Russians can influence Iran?
Of course, we have close and continuing contact with the Russians in a variety of venues, including in the Security Council. We're both permanent members of the Security Council. There's a lot of business that we do with the Russians. We've been talking to the Russians, of course, almost continuously since the start of this conflict. The Russians voted for UNSCR 2254, which has the political process, a political transition, and a ceasefire process contained in it. So they are co-sponsors of that resolution with us, and that's the basis on which we talk to them.
Mr. Rayburn, is this about Syria, or is this about a Russian-American rivalry?
That goes beyond my particular portfolio. When I and my team and Ambassador Jeffrey, who's my very close colleague, when we deal with the Russians, we're talking about Syria.
If there's a political solution to the Syrian issue, how is Iran going to withdraw its armed groups from the ground, Hezbollah, the armed Shia militias? How do you think this is going to happen?
We think that, there's, as I mentioned, there's a growing international consensus around the idea that Iranian commanded forces are going to have to withdraw from all of Syria in order to sustainably settle this conflict. So as we're talking about the political process, we're talking about an end state in Syria where the foreign intervention forces that came into Syria from 2011 onward, that they're no longer in Syria, that there's a process by which they're disengaging from Syria.
You still have boots on the ground in Syria.
Yes.
One time you withdrew, then you changed your mind, you stayed in Syria. Can we have a final word or explanation about your presence in Syria? What's your role now?
Well, President Trump's been very clear about this. He took the decision to maintain a residual U.S. force in Syria as part of the global coalition to defeat ISIS in order to continue the pressure on Daesh. Now that the physical caliphate of Daesh has been destroyed by the operations of the global coalition and our local partner forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria, but also the Iraqi security forces in Iraq, there has to be a follow-on phase to keep the pressure on Daesh, to help stabilize local communities so that there's not room for Daesh to make a resurgence, a return, which we've seen their predecessors do in the past. And so that's the mission that President Trump has given to our military forces who will stay on in Syria, is to keep the pressure on and make sure that Daesh can't return.
Okay, so you're clearing those cities from Daesh, and there's a good example, which is Raqqa. But then those cities are remaining totally destroyed. No reconstruction is happening. The youth are still unemployed. So what are the guarantees that in a couple of years, when the Syrian youth is as frustrated as ever, not going to go back to another terrorist group or fanatic group or militarized group?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that have to happen. First of all, you're absolutely right. The challenges in these places that have been liberated from Daesh are immense because Daesh instilled such destruction. They carried out such destruction in the local communities, local societies. They carried out a genocide against the Yazidis in northern Iraq, for example, and that's going to take a lot to come back from. So when we talk about stabilizing these communities, it's more than just seeing that they're supporting local authorities in restoring essential services and in rebuilding infrastructure and buildings and things like that. There's also political stabilization. You have to account for what's happened. You have to, on the one hand, you have to address grievances that existed before, but you also have to have some measure of accountability for atrocities, for terrorism that was carried out. So it's a tough problem set. That's the first aspect of it. The second is that the Daesh Caliphate, in an unusual way, was fueled not just by local conflicts, but by an influx of international foreign terrorist fighters who came into Syria and Iraq from all around the world. And a lot of those, that's who have been the diehard fighters in the last little pockets of the ISIS caliphates. The infiltration of foreign fighters has really come to almost a halt. They used to try to cross the border into Syria and Iraq from the north in particular. So with the destruction of the physical caliphate, that foreign element is essentially neutralized. It's shrinking, it's neutralized, and that was a very destabilizing element. That's what made the Daesh Caliphate uniquely savage in that respect.
Okay, so the Caesar Act is now in front of the Congress.
Right.
It's good because it's a form of impunity. It will put some people accountable to what they've done. But on the other hand, it will halt any effort to reconstruct any part of Syria, whether on a government level, on a private sector level, or even small businessmen who tend to fix their city or town inside Syria. Can you first explain what is the Caesar Act? Why is the US going down that track? So
the Caesar Act is named for the very brave Syrian man who goes by the pseudonym Caesar, who smuggled out the documentary evidence and the photos of the incredible atrocities that the Assad regime was carrying out in its prisons in particular, something that looks straight out of the Nazi death camps from the Second World War, something that was just unthinkable that it could happen in the 21st century, but there it is happening on a massive scale. And so it was very important. The spirit behind the Caesar Act is that there has to be some measure of accountability for those who carried out these atrocities in Syria, or else you're not going to have true political reconciliation. How can half the country, which has been displaced from its homes, how can they feel that they can come home safely if the same killing machine is still in place and there hasn't been any accountability for it? So that's the overwhelming element behind the Caesar Act, and that's why we're so supportive of it in the Trump administration, and we really look forward to being able to have those new authorities.
Good, but like if I have relatives in Raqqa, which is again a good example of the clearing of ISIS, and I want to send some money to rebuild my home or my relatives' homes or some friends that I have, this act will stop me from putting any money in Syria now, right?
No, look, the Syrian government was already under sanction and cut off, essentially, from the international financial system for its previous behavior, not just the atrocities that it's carried out since 2011, but also because it was a state sponsor of terrorism before. So this is about the Syrian government and its behavior. The Syrian government knows only too well the policies that it needs to halt, the behavior that it needs to cease if it wants to have access to the international financial system again.
One final question. There's a general conviction among the laymen in the streets in the Arab world that the international community don't care about Syria. They don't have oil. It's not an important country, and thus if the war remains for the coming 20 years, nobody cares. On the policy level, is this accurate?
I haven't seen...
Does anybody care about Syria?
Of course. Syria is among the top priorities for the U.S. It's among the top priorities for the European Union and for the Arab world. It's one of the top priorities that the Security Council in New York is dealing with.
It's not an oil-rich country.
It really doesn't matter because Syria is so important strategically. It's so important in the Arab world. You can't really have instability on one side of the Mediterranean and expect to have stability on other sides of the Mediterranean, for example. You can't expect to have reconstruction and stability next door in Iraq if you have chaos next door in Syria, and vice versa. The two are very closely connected. So it's incredibly important. I haven't seen any evidence that the international community doesn't care about Syria. Everywhere we go, we get a high level of interest, and there's a high level of investment in trying to get to a peaceful solution to the problem.